a little bit further east and talk about Japan. Japan is an interesting case because it's starts out during this time period as a undeveloped nation, kind of on par with India and China, right, and kind of at risk of becoming colonized. But by the end of this unit, by the end of this period, we're going to see that Japan rapidly industrializes and comes to be a power almost on the level of places like Great Britain, Russia, and the United States. And so this lecture video is going to get us to that point. And so when before the Western powers, the United States, get to Japan, just we should know a little bit about what's happening in Japan before that moment. And so in the 1600s, in 1603, there was a noble family, a family of the nobility, the Tokugawa family in Japan, and they gained control of the Japanese islands, and they essentially establish a feudal system. If you guys remember from last year, feudalism is kind of a political economic system where the king gives land to nobles or lesser lords, who then kind of control that land with kind of significant power, but they have to pay and they owe, in exchange for that land, they owe the king military service and they owe taxes. And so that system that exists in Europe also exists in Japan a bit later on. Because by this time, the 1600s roll around in Europe, feudalism is fading away. But in 1603, you have the Tokugawa family gain control of Japan, and they kind of establish themselves. The head of that family establishes himself as the shogun, or the leader, or king, right? So in European feudalism, we'd have the word king. Here in Japan, we have shogun. Then beneath him, there were these daimyo, who were the local lords or the nobles. And then beneath them were kind of minor lords known as samurai. We can kind of equate these to knights, so to speak, in Europe. Right, samurai, just like the knights, lived by a certain code. They were skilled soldiers and warriors, except samurai were not on horses, whereas knights were. As this happens, as the Tokugawa come to power, someone else in Japan loses power, and that's the emperor. And so according to Japanese legend and history, right, the emperor and the imperial family is kind of the oldest imperial family in the world, right? They've been around, if you ask in Japanese culture, they've been around since the beginning of time. But the imperial family, who traditionally and historically had ruled over Japan, now loses that power, and the Tokugawa come and take control. And what they do is they isolate Japan from the world. They kind of prevent outsiders from coming in. This is kind of how life exists in Japan with no outsiders in this feudal system until the 1850s. In 1857, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry, so he's a naval figure for the U.S. Navy, sails his boat and his fleet into Tokyo Bay and demands Japan open up its economy, right? Kind of forces them to sign these agreements with the United States and eventually other powers to open up and allow foreigners back in. When this happens, the people of Japan start noticing how technologically and militaristically and economically inferior they are to these Western powers. And the daimyo and the samurai are angry with the Tokugawa shogun because he and his predecessors had allowed this to happen, had allowed them to fall behind, and now had allowed them to be taken advantage of by other nations. So it hurts their pride, hurts their sense of independence. And so the daimyo and the samurai actually lead a revolt against the shogunate, or the shogun, and they overthrow the Tokugawa family. Here's just kind of an illustration of the two different sides, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry and the Japanese shogun meeting. And in order to kind of rally enough people in the nation to overthrow the Tokugawa, what the daimyo and the samurai do is they kind of go back to the what came before the shogun, right, which was the emperor. And so this becomes known as the Meiji Restoration, which is an important phrase, an important term that we should know. The Meiji, it translates to enlightened ruler, and the emperor is kind of seen as that Meiji, as that enlightened ruler. And so they use the emperor as kind of a symbolic ruler or figurehead of the nation. Um, well, at different points he's a figurehead, and other times he becomes kind of very powerful. But they kind of rally behind the historic notion of the Japanese emperor to kind of gain support to overthrow the Tokugawa, and it's successful. In the year 1867, this emperor of Japan is now restored as ruler of Japan. And the new kind of government in place quickly adopts Western technology and forms of governing. So by 1889, we have the Meiji Constitution, which is decreed or issued, which outlines kind of a strong central ruler, almost autocratic, almost someone who's almost like a dictator, not quite. And that was the emperor. And then there is the Diet, or the assembly, legislative assembly that kind of presents laws, votes on laws, and things like that. They also model a bureaucracy after the Western powers, right? So a bureaucracy is essentially all the different departments in a government. So take the United States, for example, right? You have the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, that's part of the bureaucracy, right? And the IRS's responsibility is to make sure everyone's paying their taxes and to keep that organized. Then you have the Department of Homeland Security, right? That's another part of the bureaucracy, and their job is to, protect the borders and make sure America is safe, right? So all these different bureaucracies, all these different departments, is kind of the model that Japan then follows as well. All right, and what we're going to see is that Japan is very successful and very quickly successful at industrializing. So if you guys can remember, take a minute to think about this. Who led industrialization in Britain and the United States? Who led that process? Right, the answer is individuals and private companies, right? They're the ones who drove the industrialization process in those nations, right? The government had much less to do with it than these private individuals, right? Because that's essentially what capitalism is, right? Individuals using their own capital to invest and innovate. Japan was very different. Japan was very far behind, arguably almost, compared to Great Britain, they're almost a century behind in the industrialization process. The United States, they're more like 50 or 60 years behind. And so they need to catch up if they want any hope of achieving a level of equality with these Western nations. And so in Japan, there's actually very heavy government involvement, right? They have the benefit of knowing what needs to be done because they have examples like the British and the Americans and the Germans before them. They have a better idea of what needs to be done for industrialization to happen. And so then the government gets involved to make sure that happens. One thing that happens is that there's kind of wealthy families that already exist in Japan, merchant families, and with the help of the government, they establish monopolies. In Japan, they're called zaibatsus. And these zaibatsu have complete control over specific industries, which helps them kind of industrialize more quickly, and they're given government aid to help them do that as well. Some of these zaibatsu names that you might recognize today because they still exist, Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, right? These were some zaibatsus established during the beginning of this industrialization period. Additionally, what Japan has that places like England, well, especially America didn't have, but places like England and Germany itself also was not as homogeneous as Japan, right? Remember, since 1603, the Japanese had banned outsiders. So there was only Japanese people, for the most part, in Japan. So there was a shared culture, a shared identity, a shared sense of pride that made it easier to industrialize, easier to get kind of everyone on board. Whereas places like the United States has such a diverse group of people that homogeneity is not there. Additionally, there was economic growth prior to the Meiji Restoration and prior to the United States forcing Japan to open up again. The Tokugawas had made some economic growth, some progress possible, which then also helped set the stage for industrialization. And lastly, right, Japan historically was used to kind of adopting and adapting to other ideas from other places. A lot of Japanese culture, like their writing and Buddhism, a major belief system in Japan, were taken from China, right? So they're used to kind of being exposed to new ideas from at least before the shogunate, and then that kind of culture makes it kind of they're more willing to adapt to new things that they learn. Whereas we learned previously, right, that the Qing dynasty was not really willing to adopt to Western ideas, and that causes them to fall behind. Right? So what are some reasons that the Western powers began creating empires, right? We talked about industrialization, right, and the need to get more natural resources, and the need to limit the growth of rival nations, right? And so the same reasons that encouraged uh, Germany and Great Britain and the United States to start expanding and creating empires is the same motivations that are going to motivate Japan. Japan's natural resources are kind of strongly limited, especially industrial resources, things like coal, for example. And so they're going to be forced to kind of go elsewhere to get more of that material. That's especially true as we get into World War II, right, the 1920s. Also, right, the whole motivation of Japan industrializing was to kind of become equals with people like Great Britain, the United States, and Germany. And so they want to try to limit the power of their rivals, and the only way to do that is to kind of expand their territory. So, following the Meiji Restoration in 1889, there are several wars that the Japanese get involved with. There's the Sino-Japanese War. Sino is kind of a way to describe people from China. So it was the Chinese-Japanese War in 1894. The Japanese take advantage of the weakened state of China at this time, and they take control of the island of Taiwan, which they call Formosa, and parts of Korea as well. This war, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, is especially important because the Japanese win this war, and it's the first time in Asia, in living memory at least, a long historic memory, that an Asian power had defeated a European power. They gained control of parts of Korea and a part of northeastern China known as Manchuria, which I will show a map in a minute to kind of give you a visualization of that. But Manchuria is important for us to remember because when we get to World War II, we're gonna need to know Manchuria. And finally, by 1910, not technically a war, right? But by 1910, Japan fully annexes or fully adds Korea, all of Korea, to its empire. Right? They made Korea part of Japan, and they disbanded the Korean army. Right? So they completely took control of Korea. So these different wars, and there's actually eventually a second Sino-Japanese War as well, help kind of bolster Japan's international image and allows for them to grow as an empire. Right, so this map here kind of just shows you the expansion of Japanese territory all the way up to the outbreak of World War II. Right, so Japan obviously is right here. Taiwan, known as Formosa to the Japanese. All these islands throughout the Pacific, right? All islands, not all of them, but a lot of them are islands that the Japanese come to take control. This here, Manchukuo, is the Japanese word for Manchuria. So at first they gained parts of Manchuria, and then over time, closer to the World War II, they gained control of all of Manchuria. Korea is right here. And during the Chinese-Japanese Wars, they take control of key coastal regions of China. Peking, Hong Kong, and so on. All right, and again, this map is a little bit later on because by 1939 we have the start of World War II, and that's when Japanese start invading, kind of a little bit later than that, they start invading non-Asian regions. All right, but this is kind of setting the stage for Japan's rise. All right, and they get to these places, they have the natural resources from these places they can use to further industrialize, and they kind of shore up strategic locations to limit the power of their rivals, like the Americans, the British, and the Germans.